Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael Lutz from the JRC. Welcome to this first of two webinars that we have this week, presenting some work that we did on spatial data on the web. Today we have a presentation from Clemens Portele of Interactive Instruments, who did some work for us under the ELISE ISA action. That is an action under the Program for Interoperability of European Public Administrations. We would like, we're happy to have Clemens here today to present the work that they did for the ELISE action on comparing the INSPIRE technical guidelines to the new best practices that we have for data on the web and spatial data on the web from the World Wide Web Consortium, and the spatial data on the web work is done jointly between the W3C and the OGC, as well as some implementation of those guidelines using the LD proxy tool. Without much further ado, I would then hand over to Clemens for the presentation, and we will have after the presentation the time to ask some questions and have some discussions. The main goal, I should maybe say, for this webinar is basically first to promote, of course, the work that has been done. But secondly, we will be organizing a dedicated session of the INSPIRE Maintenance and Implementation Technical Subgroup, the MICT, in April, that will be looking at the at this analysis that was done, looking at the spatial data on the web best practices, and see if, let's say, any additional work should be done under the maintenance and implementation work of INSPIRE to evolve, let's say, or to make it easier to share spatial data and INSPIRE data in particular through the web. So that is the main goal, that we want to collect already some initial feedback and input for that discussion that we will having in April. Okay, with that, I would hand over the floor to Clemens.
Can you make me the presenter again?
Sorry, yes.
I guess we lost that because I logged out.
Yes, of course.
So,
there you go.
All right, thank you. So welcome also from me. As Michael has said, I'm Clemens Portele from Interactive Instruments in Germany, and I'm presenting on the work that we did basically during last year on the topic of spatial data on the web in the context of INSPIRE. The background for this work is that what we see in the last years, in particular, also since we had smartphones, in seeing significant use of the web, that has increased, that access to data and use of digital information is increasingly happening over the web, and I think we can expect that this trend will continue. And the technologies, when we say web, that means there are several technologies and technological trends that are important also in the context of spatial data. For example, cloud computing, that is based on web technologies, or the Internet of Things. So that is all very relevant. So looking forward, we see that sharing data should be done in ways that is consistent with how people are using the web. People means end users and developers. And one of the backgrounds is that that spatial data infrastructures, as we have them, for example, in INSPIRE, started to use web services in open formats basically 20 years ago in the late 1990s, and the architecture has been stable since then. But when we say the web, the notion of what that means has evolved quite a bit over the last 20 years. So what was the web at that time is no longer the web basically as we have it today. So That's basically the background for the work, and concretely there are activities by W3C and OGC that Michael has mentioned. So the best practice documents, and I will start then looking at describing and illustrating some known challenges, somewhat simplified, but some known challenges with respect to using spatial data to access and share SDIs to share and access spatial data on the web, and compare that with expectations of developers or users familiar with the web. I will then discuss some recommendations that we can derive from that, and also, as Michael has mentioned, the demonstration of some of the implementations of the best practices using LD Proxy, a tool that we started to develop 2 years ago. It's an open source tool, and we also did some development as part of this activity to demonstrate some of the results. I will finalize and conclude the presentation after the demonstration of the tool with giving some updates on where we are currently in the standardization activities, because OGC and ISO TC211 are also looking into these topics very much. So Michael and I mentioned already there is this data on the web best practices developed by W3C. So that's not related to spatial data. It's a general best practice document. Actually, it's a recommendation. So it's a standard since January last year, and it captures not in terms of a normative standard, but in terms of providing guidance, what you should do when you want to share your data on the web to actually maximize the utility of that data for others. On top of that, there has been an activity, and it's 35 best practices in general. And on top of that, there has been a joint activity between W3C and OGC that started basically 3 years ago, and that resulted in another best practice document, the spatial data on the web best practices, which builds on top of the W3C ones and defines 14 additional ones. And these are related, I think, in general to 2 aspects. One of it, you can see them, the 14 best practices here in the screenshot. They relate to the things that are really specific to spatial data, like geometries, coordinate reference systems, but also to some extent to some cultural things that we see in our community, and also it has a discussion about some of the gaps that we see in terms of how metadata is used, or how SDIs are structured compared to the general data on the web best practices. So to illustrate that, let me just discuss a little bit where when we look at how we actually search, evaluate, and use data in an SDI, how that works for those who are experts in the field, but it's hard for someone who has never worked with spatial data before, or who's not an expert in that field. So when the idea of SDIs is when we look for data, what we do is we open the GeoPortal or some GeoPortal in the web browser. We see here the Inspire one, and that, for example, for most people already requires that you know that there exist such things as GeoPortals, because most people will just start searching in their search engine that they typically use. So then in the GeoPortal you navigate to search, which maybe require a little bit of effort if you have never been there. You enter search text and potentially work on structured search criteria that you have to try to understand, and then you find some metadata records. You look through them and select one that you want to have a closer look at, and then you review the metadata, and that metadata is, let's say, I think for most people, quite hard to understand. It's mostly addressing experts, GIS specialists that are familiar with the language and the concepts of spatial data. Then you may see a link to a download service where you can access the data, and then you follow that link, and what you get is you don't download the data, you end up at an XML page. So for example, the WFS capabilities document. But if you don't know what that is and what to do with that, you're stuck. You can't download the data. You don't see any data, or you don't really find the links to the data in itself. So you have to know that you have to use a tool, a special tool that most people probably won't have on their machine. So they have to install some stuff, know where to take this URL to the Get Capabilities document, where to put it, how to access it, etc. Because the standard web mechanisms of using MIME types or media types to delegate to applications doesn't really work in our SDIs. And then if you're there, then it's also quite hard often for non-experts to understand really the data, because it requires additional documentation. But the link to these documents is often not readily available. So if you're not familiar with it, it's quite hard to actually search, find, and then use the data. So, but what we see is what people typically do when they look for something. They enter the search criteria in their typical search environment, so typically just the address bar of the browser, and then browse for the results that the search engine behind it will return, and see if there is any data. They would like to browse through the data set to determine if it has the desired information, so without installing any software on the local computer, etc. If it works, then typically they will download the data set and do something with it, or study the online API documentation and examples to access it, and then use some existing libraries or APIs to actually work with that. So basically, people, developers and end users, they want to use the standard tools of the platform they are using. So in this case, the web, so the web browser, HTTP as a protocol, which our SDIs aren't really conforming to, delegation of applications using media types, the use of search engines, the use of HTML APIs that are consistent with the web architecture, etc. So that's different than the gap. Another topic is that that the concepts of data sets and distributions, that this is actually a figure from the data on the web best practices, and they use the concepts of data set and distribution, which is basically taken from the DCAT standard from the World Wide Web Consortium. And data set is a collection of data that's very similar to the notion that we have in Inspire, and it also has metadata. But then they also have this concept of a distribution, and that's a specific available form of a data set, and that's to support different formats or different endpoints, and a CSV file is an atom feed or an API are all examples of distributions. So in that sense, if we have, for example, a rational road network as a data set, then a file download in a national format, WMTS with a national layers, or Inspire View services, Inspire download services, each of them is a different distribution of the same data set. So some issues that we see here is if I use a geoportal, quite often and I type in, let's say, a search string for a data set, I get multiple results. Often I get one result for the data set and also one for a WMS or for a WFS, so for a distribution. But the relationship between those is often unclear in how it's presented in the GeoPortal. So that's a difficulty then for people to follow. And I think the default should always be the data set, and that's actually also what is configured in the Inspire GeoPortal, because people are looking for data, so they are interested in the data set. From there on, you want to navigate to the distributions, which in fact is that's one of the problems, is that this is not how it is actually in the Inspire metadata, because the Inspire ISO 19115 metadata model that is used, and then also the XML encoding isn't consistent with that. For example, you don't have a link from the data set to the distribution. You have only links back from the distribution via the coupled resource from the distribution back to the data set. Other discussion points, so there are these activities on DCAT-based metadata, and interestingly, they haven't seen services as a distribution, but they introduced an extension to DCAT for defining services. So I think that's another aspect to discuss, because I think that goes away from the data on the web best practices. And finally, when looking at how it's done in Inspire, another issue, potential issue, is that we see different approaches. So the standard approach would be there's only one national road network, and whether you download the national format and based on the national schema, or whether you download the Inspire representation from an Inspire download service, it's still the same data set. It's just a different distribution. But in some cases, we see the same data set as the national data set, and then the Inspire version of that national data set, where it should just be just a different distribution. So these were some of the differences that are obvious and visible. And there are several more. So what we did in the work, there is this, the document is actually, you can see down there, there is a link to the document. And that goes through all these 35 plus 14 best practices, and summarizes the key statements for each of the best practice. So what is it about in an executive summary, and also has an assessment how it's dealt with in Inspire. Is how we do it in Inspire today, is it taking care of the best practice, or is it doing differently? And then finally, to have, there's always also a link to, if there's a recommendation how to do something about this assessment, if there are any gaps, then you can find links to the recommendations. We can have a look at the document also later on. I don't want to go through all the different best practices, because that's quite detailed then. But what I want to do is focus on key aspects that the best practices state, that based on our analysis are, and also what's written in the spatial data on the best web best practices, are the key things of what the recommendations are, what to do when we think about evolving SDIs and how we share spatial data. So the first thing is really we want to currently you don't really find most spatial data on the web, because it is not seen by search engines. It is not they can't read it. Basically, they hit the capabilities document, but then they stop, and so they can't find the data. So one recommendation is to actually make it crawlable and linkable. Crawlable also makes it browsable by humans, but also crawlable and harvestable by search engine. That requires two things, basically. Each feature needs to have a persistent URI. That is already a recommendation in Inspire. And the other thing that also that what is necessary, that you need to be able to browse from the landing page for a data set distribution to each feature, so that search engines and humans in the browser can just follow their nose and end up at a feature. The second topic, harmonization of data discovery, is really, this is about when we look at how data discovery is done, then we see several developments in how search engines work. So, for example, they use a schema.org vocabulary. That is the generally accepted vocabulary, how things are classified when search engine index resources on the web. So the recommendation there is to also support first HTML. You can see that in the next block. But also to support then the schema.org vocabulary, so that people or search engines don't just have to read the HTML and try to understand what's in there, but that machines can actually understand the contents of web pages without just looking at the text. So the idea is that in some future, currently there is not that much of support by search engines because they don't have much data to harvest. But hopefully we'll be able to search better and better for spatial data also in the standard search engines in the future. Finally, then the next block is using the current web practices. That basically means no longer using HTTP as a tunnel, which mostly the current web services that we're using are doing. That was basically the technology 20 years ago. But that we're using HTTP as it is used. So basically, you use web APIs, data APIs that are consistent with a web architecture, and also consider that we provide the data like geometries or the size of the data in chunks that are fit for use by web applications and users, and that we provide the different encodings that people are preferring. And finally, one thing that also Inspire hasn't really tackled is to make it useful on the web. Linking data with other data is important, so that basically a web is created. So that is another topic that we recommend looking at closely. The general approach of the recommendation is that we assume that we already have the infrastructure and that any changes to Inspire will be evolutionary. So we build on the existing legal framework and also build on the existing technical guidance framework to maintain the infrastructure, but at the same time that we find mechanisms how we can actually explore and test new technical options within that framework or on top of that framework. And in our recommendations in the document, we prioritize gaps that we can explore in experiments that are based on the current infrastructure. Some of the things are harder, some of the things are easier, and we looked at the lower hanging fruit there, basically. And I think that, and the other thing that also is where we think that whatever is done can also then help increasing the use and also the utility of the data from access from the Inspire Service Network to users. So what we actually also did then in the second part, beside the report with the analysis, that we also continued explorations of following a proxy approach. In the lower hand of the diagram, you see basically our Inspire SDI infrastructure with the discovery services and download services and other services. We actually only use those direct access download services with WFSs that are very flexible, support complex models, any model, any coordinate reference system, GML, XML based structures, very rich queries, and which are addressing the GIS experts and developers. But with a proxy, we wanted to implement basically the spatial data on the web best practices that you can see here, and also then basically enable that search engine crawlers can access the data, and also web developers, putting web developers in quotes. I don't think that's not a homogeneous group, but I think there are some general patterns that we can build on. So basically, on the left-hand side, I've listed the key 5 best practices that we looked at in this from the 14 best practices, and that we specifically implemented. This just the details I've discussed a little bit on the previous slides. So the tool that we are used in that is LD proxy. Basically, it's linked data proxy, although it's not meant as linked data in the sense of RDF. It's linked data in the sense of web technologies, web architecture, and linking. It's an open source tool that we started to develop more than 2 years ago in a GeoNotebook test bed that we did together also with GeoCats, where Paul van Genochten is giving the second webinar on Thursday, where we actually explored that for the first time, and where we provided them back input into the W3C OGC work. You can find the links here on how to install it and how to configure service. For example, one of the things that we did in the Elise project is to develop a user interface in the browser, how you can actually configure the services, because at the back end we access the WFS, but on the front end it is an API that supports the spatial data on the spatial data on the web best practices. But we need to define the mapping, etc. So what I want to do now is show you a little bit of a demo, and so basically this is a site accessing an Inspire service on the back end. You can see here that is basically the link to the WFS. So that's the live capabilities that we have from, it's a touch service for protected sites. And basically the LD proxy is accessing it live. So there is no data stored in the proxy. Basically it takes all the information like the description, the keywords, the contact information, the license, the extent, etc. from the capabilities. This one has just one feature type, protected sites, and I can start browsing through it. The speed then is exactly the speed from the WFS, so the faster it is. So basically, what we do is we provide then for this feature type the first 10 features that are configurable on that page, and then we can browse through the data set and get to more features, and then of course also go to one specific feature. Here's another one that's now a German service, and again that has a slightly longer description, including some HTML markup, which we currently don't use but could use. And here again you have the link to the capabilities document. But you can see here. So what we did in the configuration, we slightly changed the titles of the attributes so they are more human readable and technical, and also styled some of the results. So basically, that is now one feature as an HTML, but you saw you have links to each of the features you can follow, and search engines can actually search for it. And just to demonstrate how it works with embedded data on schema.org for search engines. So that's a Google testing tool for structured data. So I put in the URL of our LD proxy feature, which is one named place, and then we will see it accesses the HTML on the left-hand side, and you can see that it parsed on the right-hand side the schema.org information. So Google or other search engines, Bing, etc., they know when they search it, it's a place. So by default, we map everything to schema.org place. It has the name. It also has the coordinates. So it has also the search engine knows spatial information, and we also include some additional links to a map representation and also to the original feature in the WFS. What the tool also supports is actually filtering by spatial and thematic aspects. So, for example, you can see it here in the address bar already, but we support that also in the HTML. So we have here looked for geographic names that start with LIE and then a wildcard, and have the local type of basically a water body using the geographic names, name, place feature structure. And I could edit that. I could basically also add a spatial filter to it, or I could also, let's say, remove the local type, apply the filter. You can see the changes up here in the URL using basically the simple web API, and it has now filtered all the places that start with LAE in that bounding box. So that is basically a capability. And we could then also, when I go to an individual one, you can always see here on the right-hand side. So this is the HTML representation, obviously, but we can also access the GML. So that's basically then straight from the WFS, what you get from the WFS. But we can also get the GeoJSON, which is then converted from the GML by the LD proxy, or also linked data JSON, JSON LD, which is using the schema.org semantics that you have seen in the structured data testing tool. Another topic that is important when we think about addressing the developers. So this is great for so that users can browse through a data set, and that includes then also developers. But when you're a developer, you also want to use an API to actually talk to it, and we've seen the API in use in the address bar. But a key thing that we're actually doing is we're leveraging a specification was called Swagger earlier. It's now an open standard and open API that is basically replaces what capabilities did in an SDI, and it's something that is used by the whole industry, not just the spatial community. And that is, it's basically, you can see it here. It's a JSON documentation of the API, and that's an HTML rendered version, which is also great because it gives you the capability. Here we are now looking again at the Dutch protected sites. It gives you also the ability to directly explore. So you have a description of the API with all the parameters. Let me say I just want to access 3 features. I can execute the query and it presents to me the result, and I see the resulting. I ask for JSON here, so I get the GeoJSON representation of the result, but I could also ask for the XML and get the result. So it's very easy for developers to explore how does the API work, and that gives them a much easier access to the data and to the API to access it. Here you can see the GML version, and you can test and explore the whole API. Finally, to conclude that, one other thing that you can do with that definition. So I just switched to Swagger Hub, which is basically a commercial offering for hosting your API definitions, so that basically people can find your API definitions. So that's actually one for the cadastral parcels in NRW. That's a service that is run on a government machine here in LD-proxy nrw.de, and here you again see the open API definition, and on the right-hand side again the HTML rendered version. So that's basically the same as you have seen on the side of the LD-proxy, but what the tools of Swagger, and there are many others in addition, is that you can go here if you like the API, and you can then quickly generate stubs code for servers or also for clients. So you can generate a JavaScript client or a Python client or a Java client, a TypeScript client, and so if I do that, it will just download the Python generated client, where it takes a lot of information from here, all the parameters that are in there, including schema information, etc. So that's all included in here, and I can use that then as a quick starting point to actually develop software. So let me switch back to the presentation for the final bits. So hopefully that gave you an idea of a starting point of what of the direction that's possible when we think about supporting some of the best practices, and that already has a significant impact in the last 6 months or 1 year, also on standardization. So currently there is a revision of WFS, with feature service in progress in OGC and ISO, based on the best practice and actually based on the API that we have been using also in these experiments. That actually, in addition to that, does more than that. So it supports a more developer-driven process. It's open to everyone. So not just the final result is open, but all the technical discussions are happening here on GitHub, something where developers feel familiar with. So you can go there and see all the discussions, all the changes, follow a more modular approach. Want to redesign how actually the data is accessed through these APIs, so that basically a single API has the building blocks of the WFS and the WMS, so you can access the features and the maps. We support Open API as an alternative to capabilities. No mandatory encoding, no schema required, and also security considered in the design, which is something that I think also Inspire has been struggling with from the beginning. And more for information, there are also currently some OGC Innovation Program initiatives, in addition to the Standards Program initiatives So next week we'll be having a hackathon where companies from, I think, 4 continents will meet and develop software on the current draft, which is basically the same as we've seen in the LD proxy demonstration, and to advance the standardization. And also next month, there's another OGC testbed that is starting, and that will also look at site tests for these kind of APIs that we're supporting. So for WS 3.0, the next version, and also looks into supporting for more complex features and more complex queries, where currently the work on the first part of WFS 3.0 looks at simpler schemas, simpler geometries, no 3D support, etc., and also looks closer at the security integration. That concludes my presentation, and I think we can open up the floor for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Clemens. This was really a presentation full of content and I think interesting things. So I'm quite sure that people have questions or comments. As I said previously, please raise your hand using the button next to your name if you want to say something or have a question. The floor is open. Unfortunately, there's too many of you, so I have to scroll up and down to see if there's anybody who has a question. I have a hand here from Stefan Brinkmann. Do you have a question? Please. Okay. That doesn't seem to be the case. And we have Rafael Martinez, please. Hello? It doesn't seem to work. We have a few questions in the chat from, okay, Rafael Martinez. What will be the following steps after the hackathon?
Okay, so after the hackathon, basically what we will do is, so if you want to follow the hackathon, we actually have also a public GitHub repository. It's OpenGeospatial and then WFS3 hackathon. Actually, we started to populate it this morning, so you will see more information coming up, particularly next week when we are actually going through the process. I'm not entirely sure what we will get out of it, but that's the nice thing about a hackathon. But what we're looking for is learn. So basically what we have designed so far is the API based on our understanding and our experiments with how it works with an HTML interface, etc. And we want to get feedback from many other organizations who start developing software with it based on the Open API definition. So we want to learn is how can we improve the Open API definition so that it's easier to develop the software. What do we need to change? We had a lot of discussion. That's what you can see basically if you go to the issues. We have currently 23 open issues. I will be closing some more in the afternoon, and we have finalized some additional ones. So hopefully we'll come up with a new version that will then be tested basically as a next step in the OGC testbed. But the general idea is, so at the same time, I think what we will do is start pushing the process in OGC, so that the version that we'll have after the hackathon will go through the standard process in OGC with request for comments, internal architecture board reviews, etc. We'll start the process to submit it as a new work item in ISO TC211. but I don't expect that we will have let's say, a stable version this year. The general idea is we want to take the time to collect implementation feedback, and I would expect a stable version maybe in a year from now. Because we also want to explore with developing extensions, and we want to make sure that the core part is ready, that it can be extended properly, and we don't hit any roadblocks later. So that's basically the current process.
Okay, thanks, Clemens. We have another question from Kati.
It's more of a meta question because what is the OGC status? Is the preference now for Swagger versus Slate? Because I've been focusing on the sensor things. There, the documentation is using Slate, and I'm trying to figure out which of these technologies I should follow.
To be honest, I don't have experience with Slate, so I can't. So there is basically there is no statement in. So we don't. Also in OGC, we had a discussion. We don't want to make. Let's say there was this commitment to capabilities 20 years ago, and also in the current WFS draft, we're not requiring the use of open API. I think it's basically. So what we do is that we actually require that there is an API definition, and currently there is a recommendation to use open API. But you could also set up a WFS 3.0 that uses another, for example, still supports capabilities or Slate, which I'm not really familiar with, but. We do have a conformance class for open API, and in the discussions I see much more discussion about open API than Slate.
I mean, Swagger also seems to have more points than Slate does, but okay, we'll see where that goes. It's just a side question.
Correct.
Okay, thanks, Kati. I have another question for Clemens, if I may. What I find really interesting is the story about the different definitions or conceptualizations of data sets that we have in Inspire or ISO, and the spatial data on the web and the data on the web concept of distributions. Now, the LD proxy basically sits on top of a WFS, as you said. So basically, we will just get a one-to-one mapping, let's say, of the data set that we have in Inspire or in our SDI to then data sets, maybe in different formats, but still the same conceptualization that we have in the SDI. Did you consider that in some way that you could connect maybe different WFSs that are serving different distributions of the same data set?
So one of the things that we also discussed in the whole WFS development is that currently WFS, or basically most of the I'm just looking where I have it. But basically most of the OGC web services don't really consider data sets. So OGC or WFS doesn't really say whether it's one data set or multiple. That was one of the issues that we had when we came up with the technical guidance, right? So, and it required that there is this requirement, each individual direct access download service is exactly one data set, because you can't specify that WFS has multiple data sets. So, and basically what we said here in the discussions, we don't want to make it more complicated. So for us, by default, every WFS in this WFS3 view provides access to a single data set. So it would be one distribution of one data set. We say by default, so in the future there may be extensions that do something differently. But in that sense, one of the things that we do here is point back. So when we go back to this diagram, that basically WFS is one of these distributions, and we would actually assume that there is somewhere a data set metadata that we could point back to in this distribution. but that is for me also something that needs more exploration on this relationship between WFSs or APIs and data sets.
Okay. Yeah, I was also thinking about the fact that maybe if you have a WMS and a WFS that serve the same data set, maybe you would want to have just one service in the spatial data on the web world that serves the two representation, one that is the data and one that is the map.
Yes, and that was one point that I tried to make somewhere, that we're actually not trying to build monolithic services, but that we see it rather as building blocks for APIs. So we have that statement also in here that we're actually looking for one API that can support WFS, but also WMS or WMTS. So it's so that also the relationship between where currently it's unclear that a WMS and a WFS share the same data, and we want to make that clear by supporting in a single API both data access and also map access. And in fact, the OGC testbed 14, it's not developing something there, but it's also on a conceptual. It will look into this concept.
Okay, thank you. I have maybe two more questions. One is in the chat from Bernd Rahne, right? Interesting idea. He's basically asking whether we're planning to set up an EU level LD proxy that would basically serve all the data that is available through the Inspire Geo portal. I think it's an interesting idea. We don't have any concrete plans about that yet. I'm not sure how much that would really be feasible in terms of performance and availability, but I think it is clearly something that could be thought about for, let's say, maybe a subset of high value or pan-European data sets that are available or that will become available hopefully in the future. So it's something that we'll keep in our mind, but it's clearly an interesting idea. As Clemens said, the LD proxy software is open source, so you're basically free to use it and try it out on your own systems and servers as well. Clemens, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, so basically the slides also have a link to this page, which is basically a brief documentation of basically the concept that we've seen, also then how to deploy it, the easiest using Docker. So we have a Docker container that you can use, and then also explains how to add services using the management interface that I haven't been showing, because this was more about how to edit, how to change the service configuration, etc. We can also support adding code lists, etc. So there is work there. And all the sources are also in the GitHub repository, LD proxy, and basically the document that is the report of the work we haven't implemented all the ideas that are in there on how we can improve, let's say, also the usefulness of the HTML representation. So when you go to the GitHub repository, you can see the issues, and there are also quite a number of ideas of enhancements on how we can actually make it more useful. So there is work to do that we can think of to actually make it even more useful.
Okay, thanks. I guess this was a short call for funding, in case people are interested.
Or pull requests.
Yeah, or support. Yeah, exactly. We're nearing the 1 hour that we had planned for the webinar, so I would think we go for 2 more questions. We have one from Wim Loyen, and then we had one in the chat as well on specific guidance for supporting local government as users and producers of data across the EU. Maybe I take that one first. We don't have any specific guidance, let's say at the European level for local government. I guess the same guidance applies for regional or national data providers as for local ones as well. But one thing I think that this presentation has shown that there are more and more relatively easy to use tools that can be used by also local authorities for their data publication and distribution as well. Maybe over to Wim for the last question.
Yes. My question is, I basically have 2 questions. The first one is, can we consider the LD proxy tool as a kind of a WFS 2.0 client?
Well, yes. I mean, it is a WFS 2.0 client, but for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the second question is, all these best practices and the WFS 3.0 developments, how will this impact the Inspire, perhaps technical guidelines, or even implementing rules, or even data specifications?
I think that's probably something for Michael. I mean, as I tried to explain, so our assumptions when we did the work was that it's too early to talk about impacting, right? So it was about experiments. So that's why we built this proxy approach on top of the infrastructure, so that people can play and learn and see, does it work, does it add value, and only if something adds value, then it should be discussed how to change something. But I think it's up to the MIG to actually discuss these kind of topics.
Yeah, exactly. I was just wanted to see if I can bring up the disclaimer that we put in the document.
I can probably go to it.
Yeah. Because basically, what Clemens said, yeah, what's written in bold here is basically exactly that. We want to start a discussion on what can be done in addition to the current guidelines, in order to make the data more usable and more easily usable by developers, mainstream ICT developers, or people using data over the web. And any other proposals to change technical guidelines or to add things to technical guidelines should be discussed in the maintenance and implementation group. And that's exactly what we want to do in April, as I said in the beginning, is to have a full day workshop, let's say, with the MIG-T, with the technical subgroup of the MIG, to go through the document, to discuss different recommendations and ideas there, and to maybe come up with let's say a work plan for the coming years, to see if at the European level and in the MIG we want to or we need to work on additional guidelines, or maybe just good practices that can be used by people on a voluntary basis in addition. What I should be saying maybe is that we have started or we've proposed in the last meeting of the MIG a new process for something that we call a good practice document. So this is an idea that that will be going on top of the technical guidance, that will be thought for exactly these kind of purposes, where you want to share something that you can do in addition to the things that you're legally required to do, because you think that you may want to do something useful for your users. Or potentially also how to solve specific implementation issues, such as managing persistent identifiers and the like. So for these kind of things, we would like to have a relatively lightweight process in which the MIG can endorse something as a good practice that will not be mandatory to follow, but it will be just something that people in the member states think is a good idea. And it will be endorsed in the Inspire framework, let's say. And I could imagine that a number of the things that are discussed in the document could go into the root of the good practice documents.
So would it then be perhaps an idea to put this forward as a kind of a workshop at the Inspire Conference 2018 in Antwerp, or?
Yeah, that could be an idea. I'm a bit hesitant because we at the JRC said last year that we would like to do a bit less next year, at this year's conference, because we were all quite fully booked last year. So I'm a bit careful in proposing that ourselves. But if there is interest in by a number of people, maybe around the web conference here, maybe you can drop me an email after the webinar, and then we can maybe think about whether we can jointly propose something along those lines.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Then I would say with these words we can close the webinar. Thanks again a lot to Clemens and everybody who participated in the discussion. As I said, we will publish the links to the document and to the slides and to the recording on the page of the event that I put in the chat earlier. And that you can also find on the Inspire website, and we will also maybe include some of the links that are included in the presentation to the tool, the LD proxy tool, and so on. If you have any questions afterwards, also feel free to drop us an email either to Robin or to me, and we will try and come back to you on these things as well. So thanks very much, and I hope to see many of you again on Thursday, when we will have the second webinar on the spatial data on the web, where we'll be looking at user feedback on metadata mainly, and that will happen on Thursday again at 2 o'clock, from 2 to 3, on the same webinar address. Thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.